we are faced with something absolutely incredible, and it is the uninvention of one of the greatest concepts ever devised, which is not to say that America ever functioned according to its objective. We moved toward it. We fought one terrible war over race already. We may be headed toward a second. But what is not well understood by, I think, almost anyone who is doing this is, one, what happens when you take a flawed but highly functional society like ours and you break it, right? There is a sense, and you will hear people say again and again, that we're going to have to destroy this thing in order to build something better. And what they don't understand is what a power vacuum does. Mm-hmm. If they had gardened, if they had tilled up some soil, and they had decided that that was the key to wiping the slate clean and planting their crops, they would discover that they had just liberated all sorts of weeds that they weren't counting on, and that it's going to take an incredible amount of work to fend them off. So we have a worse problem. And I would analogize it the following way. I want you to think about nuclear reactors, and in particular, I want you to think about Chernobyl. Now, a nuclear reactor is not in and of itself a complex system. It's a complicated system, but a nuclear reactor does not run itself. It is embedded in a complex system of humans, the designers who set the thing in motion, the people who run it, the people who regulate it. And you could walk into the control room of a nuclear reactor, and there are a lot of buttons you could flip that would not have a catastrophic effect, but you don't know which ones are which. And the Chernobyl story actually tells us something important. For those of you who don't remember, and I would actually recommend you check out the HBO miniseries on what happened at Chernobyl. Mm-hmm. What happened at Chernobyl was a safety test. It was a test designed to make us more secure, and they were going to run through some systems checks, and it happened that some of those systems checks set things in motion that caused the reactor to quickly overheat, and people's tendency to delude themselves about what they were seeing prevented them from shutting it down and reversing course quickly enough, and the rest is history. And the point is, what we are seeing in America today is the flipping of switches in something even more complex than a nuclear reactor. And the proposals for switches to flip next are quite frightening. Now, I don't know what to make of the story of the McCloskeys, this couple that came out in front of their home with guns and were filmed and photographed as a protest movement moved through their private street. It's a complex story, and you will see it portrayed in diametrically opposed ways depending upon which source you go to. Either it was white people brandishing weapons at peaceful protesters because they were, looking at the boogeyman in front of them, or it was people who were flagrantly frightening them by marching across private property and threatening to invade their homes. It's very difficult to figure out exactly what happened. But what appears to be going on now is that, having come to public consciousness, this couple is now a flashpoint for a war that some people seem to want to start. And if I'm to understand the story correctly, the protesters who were the ones to trigger this by marching through the McCloskeys' street are apparently going to come back. And that is not in and of itself so surprising. But what I understand is that they have asked the police for help so that presumably they don't need to brandish weapons of their own.
They, the homeowners.
They, the homeowners, have asked the police for help. And apparently the police say they can't help them. They have apparently also contacted...
They, the homeowners.
They, the homeowners, have also contacted private security, and nobody will take the job. I think that's actually not surprising. But
of course, it's not the job of private security firms to take any job that comes to them.
Well, it certainly shouldn't come down to it. Right. Every single American has the right to have their rights protected by the police. And as Sam Harris points out in not his most recent podcast, but I think the one right before, the one in which he addresses the statistics surrounding police violence and race, he says that the monopoly on violence is one of the greatest inventions that humans have ever come up with. And I have to agree with him on this. So that is a reference to, I believe it's Max Weber's suggestion that government is a monopoly on violence. That is its inherent nature, which does not mean that government is inherently violent. What it means is that a carefully wielded threat of violence, if you do not abide by the rules, is what keeps people in line. And if the rules are very good, then the threat to punish those who step outside of them, ultimately, if you step outside of the rules, somebody with a weapon comes and they take you away and you go to a court and you face due process in this country.
The possibility of violence, implicit or explicit, is what in fact keeps the peace.
Right. And, if you have, let's say, flagrantly violated the rules in some very serious way, let's say that you have assaulted somebody without cause, then somebody with a weapon, they collect you, you face due process, and you end up in a prison. Now, that prison is a kind of violence, right? Those bars that keep you in are effectively engaged in violence. You can throw yourself at them in order to engage in your freedom to go somewhere, and it doesn't let you. It's the equivalent of violence. But in any case, the point is, I find something very chilling about the McCloskey story. I have no idea who these people are or what they're about. But what I do know is that you and I face something like this, and I do know us. Okay, what we faced was
you and I.
You and I.
For those who can't see that you just gestured to me, you're talking not to the entire audience now, but
right.
That we faced something very much like this.
You and I at Evergreen faced something like this, where a mob that was possessed of crazy ideas about what we were about began to engage in flagrant violations of the rules and threats of violence, which ultimately became real violence. And our boss, the president of the college, happened also to be the boss of the police, because the police were a campus police force. They were real police, not a security force. They were a police force. But he was in a position to tell them, stay out of this, which meant that the protection that we normally have from the police was pulled out. And we were left on our own with a mob that was clearly hell-bent on re-educating us. And as I've said before, I don't think they know what they would have done if they had caught up to us and we had refused to go along with their description of the world, which we would have. So a very dangerous situation. The police refusing to be involved. This is something most people have never faced. And the fact that we are now seeing that little experiment in anarchy that happened at Evergreen being brought into the wider world, where people who have run afoul of this protest movement, who can be portrayed as zealots, are going to be left without police protection. This is the flipping of one of the switches in the reactor on which we are all depending. You flip the switch that says, what is supposed to happen if the police refuse to help you and no security force will come to your aid when you try to hire them? What recourse do you have, right? One would think that the recourse would involve going to a court and saying, I have the right to police protection. The police are not protecting me, and you must insist that they do it by some sort of court order. But we know also that because this revolution is happening in a horizontal fashion, that the courts are not immune to it. So in some sense, that switch is red for a reason. We know that pulling the police out and making it so that people cannot get a redress of grievances in a court is the thing that will cause this nation to come toppling down. Right? You cannot have some populations who have access to a court and other populations who don't. Now, that is not to say that access to courts has been even in our history. It has never gotten to even. But if you want to remove it from some populations and you want to inscribe that into the core modality that we have with each other, there is no way that this experiment can persist. Right? It is not an evolutionarily stable strategy, which means we're headed to a power vacuum.
Yeah, and this moment is not, as it would have us believe, about redress of grievances. It is about, rather, the thing that you and I have both been saying from the beginning, about flipping the tables, turning the tables of oppression, correctly identifying that there has not been equal access to things like courts and justice from police in our nation's history does not validate the conclusion that we shall change who has unequal access going forward, and that will make things right. It does not.
Yep. And I would say that if one is going to evaluate whether or not the protest movement in the street is about redress of grievances, then you need to think about things. I don't know if the McCloskeys are descended from pilgrims, but that doesn't sound like a pilgrim name. So the question is, in some sense, if these people are having their right to be protected by the police eliminated on the basis that they somehow are descended, or they are as guilty of slavery as those who held slaves themselves or something, then there's a question about, well, are we going to sort out whose guilt goes to what depth? That's preposterous. It can't happen. And so, the solutions are simply incoherent.